The mop hit the polished floor of the Kepler Prime Military Academy with a wet slap, echoing through the vast marble corridors that had witnessed the training of countless galactic officers. Marcus Chen pushed the wheeled bucket forward, his weathered hands gripping the handle with the same precision he had once used to command starships across 3 sectors of known space. "Move faster, human filth," snarled Instructor Vextar, his crystalline Valorian features catching the artificial light from the Academy's bioluminescent ceiling panels. The towering alien's 4 arms gestured dismissively at the human janitor, each movement causing the ceremonial rank crystals embedded in his exoskeleton to chime softly. "The cadets will arrive for morning formation in 30 minutes, and I will not have them see your pathetic species contaminating our halls." Marcus said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was his shield in this place. 23 years of mopping these floors, cleaning these walls, and emptying waste receptacles had taught him that words from a human mouth carried no weight in the Valorian-dominated hierarchy of the Academy. Better to let his work speak for itself, though he knew even perfection would never earn him respect from beings who viewed his entire species as an evolutionary mistake. The Academy corridors stretched before him like a monument to alien superiority. Holographic displays showed the great battles where Valorian fleets had crushed human resistance during the sector wars 3 decades ago. Portraits of distinguished alumni gazed down from the walls, all of them non-human, all of them bearing the marks of species deemed worthy of command. Not a single human face looked back at him from those gilded frames. "Sir Vextar," a younger voice interrupted the instructor's verbal assault. Cadet Zephyr, a promising Valorian youth with the typical blue-white skin and geometric tattoos marking his noble birth, approached with the fluid grace of his species. "The Terran seems to be working adequately. Perhaps we should focus on preparing the battle simulation chambers." The instructor's narrow eyes fixed on Marcus with undisguised contempt. "Adequately?" His voice rose to a pitch that made several passing Andorian cadets pause in their morning march. "This creature represents the lowest form of sentient life in our galaxy, Cadet. It exists solely because the Federation Council, in their misguided compassion, granted them protection status after their surrender. Do not mistake efficiency for worthiness." Marcus continued mopping, his movements steady and methodical. Each stroke of the mop across the floor was deliberate, practiced. These were the same movements he had perfected during countless watch rotations aboard Federation vessels, the same attention to detail that had once kept crews alive in the depths of space. Now those skills served only to clean the boots of beings who would never see him as more than a useful animal. The morning light filtering through the Academy's crystal dome began to intensify, signaling the approach of the daily formation. Soon, hundreds of cadets from across the galaxy would march through these halls, Valorians with their crystalline beauty, Androrians with their scaled dignity, Centaurians with their ethereal grace, all of them future leaders, all of them destined for greatness among the stars, and all of them learning, day by day, that humans were meant to serve. "Cadet Zephyr raises an interesting point," Vextar continued, circling Marcus like a predator studying prey. "Tell me, human, do you believe you work adequately?" The question was a trap. Marcus had seen it sprung on other humans, unfortunate enough to cross paths with Valorian instructors. Answer with confidence, and be accused of arrogance unbefitting your station. Answer with humility, and be mocked for your species' inherent weakness. Answer it all, and risk providing ammunition for whatever sadistic game was about to unfold. Marcus chose the path he had always chosen. He dipped his mop in the bucket, wrung it out with precise movements, and continued cleaning. "Speak when addressed, creature." Vextar's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Or do you lack even the basic courtesy that civilized species extend to their superiors?" "I work as needed, sir," Marcus replied quietly, never raising his eyes from the floor. Nothing more, nothing less. The instructor's laugh was like breaking glass. "As needed? How wonderfully modest. And what exactly does a failed species know about need?" He gestured broadly at the portraits lining the walls. "Do you see any humans among the honored graduates, Cleaner? Do you see your kind commanding fleets, leading expeditions, discovering new worlds?" Marcus's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the mop handle. "No, sir. No, indeed. Because your species had its chance at greatness, didn't it? The Terran colonial fleet, the Earth expeditionary forces, the grand human expansion into the outer sectors. Vextar's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting. And where did that ambition lead? Defeat, surrender, servitude. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, not because they were untrue, but because they were incomplete. The Valorian instructor spoke of defeat, but not of the civilian worlds that human forces had refused to bombard. He mentioned surrender, but not the sacrifices made to prevent genocidal war. He celebrated servitude while ignoring the quiet dignity of those who had chosen conscience over conquest. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, human?" Vextar leaned closer, his breath carrying the ozone scent of his species. "I see the perfect example of why the Federation's hierarchy exists as it does. Your people reached for the stars with hands too weak to hold them. Now you serve those strong enough to claim what you could not keep." Marcus said nothing, but something flickered behind his eyes, a flash of the man who had once stood on the bridge of a Federation battlecruiser, making decisions that affected millions of lives. The expression was gone so quickly that neither Valorian noticed, but for a moment the Academy janitor looked less like a servant and more like someone carrying the weight of choices that lesser beings could never understand. The first cadets began to appear at the far end of the corridor, their morning formation about to begin. Marcus recognized the routine. He had been invisible audience to it for over 2 decades. Soon the halls would fill with the sound of marching feet, shouted commands, and the casual arrogance of young beings certain of their superiority. And he would continue cleaning as he always did, while they learned lessons about leadership from instructors who had never faced the choices that true command demanded. The Academy dining hall stretched across nearly half a kilometer, its vaulted ceiling decorated with constellation maps from every known sector of the galaxy. Long tables arranged by species created invisible barriers more effective than any physical walls. Valorians at the center beneath banners of crystalline honor, Androrians to the east under scales depicting ancient victories, Centaurians occupying the elevated western platform where they could observe all others with their characteristic detached superiority. Marcus entered through the service entrance, pushing a cart laden with industrial cleaning supplies. The evening meal was in full swing, hundreds of cadets engaged in the ritualized consumption that served as much social function as nutritional necessity. Their conversations created a multilingual symphony of ambition, competition, and casual supremacy that had become the soundtrack to his invisible existence. "The human approaches," announced Cadet Crixnell, a particularly large Valorian whose family controlled 3 mining sectors in the Outer Rim. His voice carried easily across the nearby tables, causing dozens of heads to turn toward Marcus. "How fortuitous! I was just explaining to our Androrian friends about the proper hierarchy of service species." Marcus began his routine maintenance of the serving stations, his movements deliberately efficient and unobtrusive. He had learned to make himself functionally invisible during these social gatherings, but invisibility was not the same as safety. Sometimes the cadets needed entertainment, and a human janitor provided an acceptable target for demonstrations of superiority. "Tell me, cleaner," Crixnell continued, rising from his seat with the fluid grace that marked his noble breeding. "Do you believe your species serves adequately in its current capacity?" The question was designed to humiliate, and everyone in the immediate vicinity recognized it as such. Androrian cadets leaned forward with predatory interest, while several Centaurians descended from their elevated platform to observe the interaction more closely. Marcus had witnessed this performance countless times, sometimes as audience, sometimes as unwilling participant. "I perform the duties assigned to me," Marcus replied without looking up from the cleaning station he was sanitizing. "Nothing more is required." "Nothing more is required," Crixnell repeated mockingly, his forearms spreading in theatrical amazement. How wonderfully humble. But surely even a human can appreciate the beauty of ambition, the drive to excel beyond mere adequacy. A small figure moved through the crowd of observers, unnoticed by the cadets focused on their evening's entertainment. The newcomer was young, perhaps 12 standard years, with the mixed features that marked her as one of the rare hybrid offspring sometimes produced by cross-species relationships. Her skin held the pale luminescence of Valorian heritage, but her eyes carried the warmth and depth that genetics programs couldn't quite eliminate from human bloodlines. "My species has learned to find satisfaction in service," Marcus answered, his tone remaining level despite the growing audience. "Ambition led to conflict. Service brings peace." The response was perfect, exactly the kind of self-deprecating submission that satisfied Valorian expectations while avoiding the trap of false humility. But Crixnal was not satisfied with mere verbal surrender. His family's wealth came from exploitation of conquered worlds, and he had inherited more than just mining rights from his ancestors. Service brings peace, the Valorian cadet mused, circling Marcus like a hunter evaluating prey. How philosophical for a janitor. But philosophy is an abstract concept, isn't it? Perhaps a more concrete demonstration would be educational for our younger cadets. He gestured toward a nearby table where several first-year students sat watching with wide eyes. You see, true service requires more than just performing assigned duties. It requires understanding one's place in the natural order. Crixnal reached across the table and swept his hand across a plate of half-finished food, sending the contents scattered across the floor. The mixture of exotic fruits and synthesized proteins created a colorful mess that several nearby cadets found amusing enough to deserve applause. "Clean that," Crixnal commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had never been denied. "Now. And since you spoke so eloquently about service bringing peace, you may consume it as you clean. A practical demonstration of human dietary flexibility." The dining hall grew quiet. This level of humiliation crossed lines that even the most prejudiced cadets recognized as excessive. Several Androrian students exchanged uncomfortable glances, while a few Centaurians actually stepped back from the scene. But none of them spoke. None of them intervened. Marcus stared at the scattered food on the floor, his weathered hands still gripping the cleaning cloth he had been using. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Not the broken resignation of a servant, but the cold calculation of someone deciding whether the consequences of action were worth bearing. "Is there a problem, human?" Crixnal pressed, misreading the pause as hesitation born of cowardice rather than restraint. "Or does your species require additional motivation to demonstrate proper gratitude for the privilege of service?" The young hybrid cadet pushed through the crowd of observers, her small form easily overlooked by the larger aliens focused on the drama before them. She moved with purpose, her pale face showing an expression of growing distress as she witnessed the unfolding humiliation. Marcus made his decision. He had endured worse degradations in his decades of service, and this moment would pass like all the others. The academy needed its entertainment, and he needed his position. There were responsibilities that extended beyond personal dignity, commitments that required him to swallow pride, along with whatever scraps ended up on the floor. He knelt beside the scattered food, his movements slow and deliberate. The dining hall remained silent, hundreds of cadets watching as a member of the species that had once challenged Valorian supremacy prepared to literally eat their contempt. "Stop!" The voice was young, clear, and carried an authority that no child should possess. The hybrid cadet stepped into the circle of observers, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. Every eye in the immediate area turned toward her, confusion replacing anticipation, as cadets tried to understand why a first-year student would interrupt an upperclassman's demonstration. "I said stop," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "You can't do that to him." Crixnal's crystalline features shifted from amusement to irritation. "Cadet Zara, return to your table immediately. This does not concern first-year students." But the girl, Zara, didn't move. She stood between Marcus and the scattered food, her young face showing a courage that made several nearby cadets step back involuntarily. When she spoke again, her words carried across the dining hall with perfect clarity. "That's my father." The words hung in the air like a gravitational anomaly, bending the normal flow of conversation and expectation around their impossible weight. The dining hall, moments before filled with the casual cruelty of privileged youth, now existed in a bubble of stunned silence that seemed to stretch across parsecs. "Your father?" Crixnal's voice cracked slightly on the word, his forearms dropping to his sides as he stared at the small hybrid girl who had just shattered every assumption in the room. "That's impossible. You're Cadet Zara Velthari. Your records clearly indicate—" "My records indicate what they need to indicate," Zara interrupted, her young voice carrying a steel that made several upperclassmen unconsciously step backward. "But that doesn't change the truth. Marcus Chen is my father in every way that matters." Marcus remained kneeling beside the scattered food, but his entire posture had changed. The resigned submission was gone, replaced by something that made the air around him feel charged with potential energy. When he looked up at Zara, His eyes held a warmth that transformed his weathered features completely. "Zara," he said softly, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do." She turned to face the crowd of cadets, her pale skin carrying an inner luminescence that marked her Valorian heritage, even as her determination spoke to something entirely human. "All of you need to hear this. All of you need to understand what you've been doing." Instructor Vextar had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his crystalline features displaying the kind of administrative panic that occurred when carefully maintained social orders suddenly collapsed. Academy protocols had no provision for this situation, no regulation covering what happened when the invisible servant class suddenly acquired inconvenient connections to the student body. "Cadet Velthari," Vextar's voice carried forced calm, "return to your quarters immediately. This disruption will be dealt with through proper channels." "No." Zara's refusal was quiet but absolute. "I've watched for 3 years. 3 years of seeing him treated like something less than sentient, and all of you, every single one of you, participated because it was easier than questioning what you were taught." She gestured toward Marcus, who had finally risen to his feet, his cleaning supplies forgotten. "Do you want to know who Marcus Chen really is? Do you want to know why a human is working as a janitor in the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy?" "Zara, please." Marcus's voice held a note of warning that several cadets recognized as the tone used by beings accustomed to command. "Some truths are better left buried." Zara's laugh held no humor. "Like everything else about human contributions to the galaxy. Like the Battle of Kepler Station, where Commander Marcus Chen held off 3 Valorian battle fleets long enough for civilian transports to evacuate Sanctuary Colony." The name hit the dining hall like a kinetic weapon. Several older cadets immediately accessed their neural implants, cross-referencing historical records with growing expressions of disbelief. Commander Marcus Chen was legend, the human officer, who had somehow outmaneuvered vastly superior Valorian forces during the final days of the Sector Wars, buying time for what historians called the Great Evacuation. "Or maybe you'd prefer to discuss the Andorian peace accords?" Zara continued, her voice growing stronger as she watched recognition dawn in alien eyes, where the same Commander Chen refused direct orders to bombard civilian populations, choosing court-martial over genocide. "Would you like to hear about how that decision saved 4 billion lives across 12 worlds?" Crixnal's crystalline skin had shifted to a pale grey that indicated shock in his species. "The Marcus Chen died in the war," he protested weakly. "Records show he was executed for refusing to commit war crimes," Marcus said quietly, finally speaking for himself. "The execution was faked. The Federation Council decided that a martyred human hero might be more dangerous than a living one, so they created a new identity, a new life, and a very clear understanding of the consequences if that life ever became complicated." The implications rippled through the crowd like shockwaves. If the Academy's janitor was actually one of the most celebrated military commanders in recent galactic history, what did that say about everything they had been taught about human inferiority? What did it mean that they had spent years watching a genuine hero clean their waste? "But the records," Instructor Vextar stammered, his administrative mind struggling to process the magnitude of the deception. "Your genetic profile, your background clearances, are exactly what the Federation Council wanted them to be," Marcus replied. "Deep cover identities require very convincing documentation. I should know. I helped design the protocols before my official death." Zara moved closer to Marcus, her small hand finding his larger one. The gesture was simple, but it carried an intimacy that spoke of years of shared secrets, quiet conversations, and love that had grown beyond the boundaries of species or circumstance. "He found me on Sanctuary Colony," she said, her voice softening as she looked up at the man who had raised her. "I was barely 2 years old, hidden in a shelter during the bombardment. My Valorian mother had died in the attacks. My human father was missing. Marcus could have left me there. His mission was to hold the defense perimeter, not rescue orphans." She turned back to the assembled cadets, her eyes blazing with the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to break a silence maintained for 15 years. "Instead, he carried me to the evacuation ships. He made sure I had a family to take me in. And when the war ended and the adoption records were sealed, he found a way to stay close. He became a janitor at the academy where I would eventually train, spending decades invisible and humiliated just so he could watch over the child he had saved." The dining hall remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed completely. Where before it had held anticipation for cruelty, Now it carried the weight of shame and dawning understanding. These cadets, future leaders of the galactic community, were confronting the reality that they had spent years tormenting one of the greatest heroes their civilization had produced, and they had never once thought to look beyond their own prejudices to see the man beneath the janitor's uniform. Marcus squeezed Zara's hand gently, pride and terror warring in his expression as he watched his carefully constructed life crumble around them. The safety that anonymity had provided was gone, but looking at his adopted daughter's fierce courage, he found he could not bring himself to regret its loss. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull oxygen from the vast dining hall. Then, like a dam bursting under impossible pressure, the quiet shattered into chaos. "Neural records confirm it," whispered Cadet Thisara, an Androrian whose scaled features had gone pale with shock. Her implant display flickered with historical data streams as she cross-referenced decades-old battle reports. Strategic profile matches, tactical preferences align perfectly. The Kepler Station Gambit, nobody else could have conceived that maneuver. "The evacuation corridors," added another cadet, his Centaurian vocal cords producing harmonics of amazement. "The civilian shipping lanes that somehow stayed open during the siege." Everyone always wondered how the logistics worked, how someone managed to coordinate 17 different species evacuation protocols while under bombardment. Krixnal stood frozen, his forearms hanging uselessly as his worldview collapsed around him. The food he had scattered across the floor, intended as a tool of humiliation, now seemed to mock him instead. Every cruel word, every casual dismissal, every moment of assumed superiority replayed in his memory with nauseating clarity. "This is impossible," Instructor Vextar protested, though his voice lacked conviction. His crystalline skin had shifted to the mottled grey-blue that indicated severe distress in Valorians. "Security protocols, background investigations. The Federation Council would never—" "The Federation Council did exactly what political bodies always do," Marcus interrupted, his tone carrying the patient authority of someone who had spent decades watching history repeat itself. "They buried the inconvenient truth beneath layers of comfortable lies. A dead human hero posed no threat to the new order. A living one, especially one whose actions had saved both human and alien lives, might have complicated the narrative." Zara hadn't released his hand, her young fingers intertwined with his weathered ones, in a gesture that spoke volumes about trust earned through years of quiet dedication. "Tell them about the Accords," she said softly. "Tell them what you sacrificed." Marcus hesitated, old instincts warring with the reality that secrecy was no longer possible. "The Andorian peace accords required someone to take responsibility for human war crimes," he said finally, "real ones and imagined ones. The Federation needed a scapegoat to satisfy Valorian demands for justice, and I had already made myself politically inconvenient by refusing to target civilian populations." "So they offered you a choice," Zara continued, when his voice faltered. "Execution as a war criminal, or disappearance into a life of service. Death with dishonor or life with invisibility." The implications rippled through the assembled cadets like gravity waves from a collapsing star. Their entire educational experience was built on the foundation of species hierarchy, with humans occupying the lowest tier due to their defeat in the sector wars. But if that defeat had been chosen rather than inevitable, if their greatest military commander had deliberately accepted humiliation to prevent genocide, then everything they had been taught required re-evaluation. "The Sanctuary Colony evacuation," Cadet Zephyr spoke for the first time since the revelation began, his young Valorian features creased with concentration. "My family's mining consortium controlled that sector. The official records state that human forces abandoned their posts, leaving civilians defenseless. Your family's mining consortium wanted the mineral rights," Marcus replied, without heat, stating simple fact rather than accusation. "Civilian populations were inconvenient to their development plans. The bombardment was intended to clear the colonies for resource extraction." Zephyr's scales shifted color as ancestral memories and current reality collided. "But the evacuation ships, how did they get through our blockade? Our fleet commanders were some of the finest." "They were adequate," Marcus said diplomatically, "but they were fighting the wrong battle. While they focused on destroying my small fleet, I was coordinating with civilian authorities across 17 different colonies. Every transport that escaped carried refugees from multiple worlds, not just Sanctuary." "You let them destroy your fleet," Thaisara breathed, understanding dawning in her reptilian features. The entire engagement was a diversion. "I let them think they were destroying my fleet," Marcus corrected. "Most of my ships were running on skeleton crews, volunteers who knew the mission was suicide. The real evacuation was happening in shipping corridors your admirals never thought to monitor because they were too focused on winning a glorious military victory." The dining hall had become an impromptu history lesson, with hundreds of cadets receiving their first accurate account of events that had shaped the galaxy's political landscape. For many of them, especially the younger students, these revelations fundamentally challenged everything they believed about their own species' superiority and human inferiority. "But why?" Crixnall finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why accept such degradation? Such service? You could have disappeared completely, found some quiet world to live out your days in peace." Marcus looked down at Zara, his expression soft with paternal love. "Because I made a promise to a dying woman on Sanctuary Colony. I told Zara's mother I would make sure her daughter had a future worth living. That required making sure the galaxy became a place where hybrid children could grow up to command starships instead of hiding from prejudice." "The long game," Zara added, pride evident in her voice. "He's been playing the long game for 15 years, watching, learning, understanding how the Academy really works, how the Federation's officers are trained, what biases they carry, where the system breaks down." Several cadets exchanged uncomfortable glances as they realized the implications. If Marcus had been observing the Academy's training methods for decades, he possessed unprecedented insight into the Federation's military culture, its strengths, weaknesses, and blind spots. "What happens now?" Instructor Vextar asked, his administrative mind finally grappling with practical concerns. "The protocols for this situation don't exist," Marcus finished, "because the people who created those protocols never imagined their carefully buried past would literally stand up in the middle of dinner service." He surveyed the assembled cadets, these future leaders who would shape the galaxy's destiny. Some looked ashamed, others confused. A few appeared to be recalculating everything they thought they knew about power, service, and the true meaning of strength. "Now," Marcus said quietly, "we all learn whether the Federation's ideals about unity and mutual respect are more than just words painted on Academy walls." The scattered food still lay on the floor between them, but nobody moved to clean it up. It had become something more than refuse, a symbol of casual cruelty transformed into a monument to the blindness that allowed good people to participate in systemic injustice. And in the growing silence, everyone present understood that this moment would define not just their own futures, but the character of the civilization they would inherit. The Academy's administrative center had never been designed for crisis management of this magnitude. Emergency protocols existed for everything, from asteroid impacts to hostile fleet incursions, but nowhere in the vast databases of contingency plans was there a procedure labeled, "What to do when your janitor turns out to be a legendary war hero presumed dead for 20 years. Admiral Kethmore paced behind her desk, her centaurian form casting shifting shadows across the holographic displays that dominated the office walls. Each screen showed a different angle of the dining hall incident, recorded by security systems that monitored every public space in the Academy. The footage was damning in its clarity, hundreds of witnesses, multiple species, and absolutely no possibility of containing the information through normal channels. "How long before this reaches the Galactic Council?" she asked her aide, a nervous Valorian functionary, whose crystalline skin had taken on the deep blue hue that indicated extreme stress. "It already has, Admiral," Assistant Director Kelneth replied, his 4 hands dancing across multiple data tablets simultaneously. 17 cadets transmitted the footage to their family networks within minutes of the incident. 3 news services have picked up the story. The Federation Intelligence Service is requesting immediate clarification of Academy security protocols. Admiral Kethmore stopped pacing, her ethereal features settling into the mask of calm that had served her through 3 decades of military service. And the subjects in question? Confined to separate holding areas pending investigation. The human, Marcus Chen, has been cooperative. The cadet, Zara Velthari, is less compliant. The Admiral's expression shifted slightly, showing what passed for amusement among her species. Defiant? She bit Security Chief Trelox when he attempted to separate her from Chen, drew blood. Then she demanded to speak with the Federation Council's Human Rights Commission, the Interspecies Ethics Board, and, I quote, Anyone with sufficient authority to explain why a war hero has been living as slave labor for 23 years. Despite the magnitude of the crisis, Admiral Kethmore found herself impressed. The child showed spine that many seasoned officers lacked. Her academic record, exemplary. Top 5% of her class in tactical analysis, xenobiology and interspecies law. Her instructors describe her as brilliant, but politically naive. Kelneth paused, accessing additional files. Though given current circumstances, perhaps naive requires re-evaluation. The Admiral moved to the central display, where Marcus Chen's true service record hung suspended in holographic detail. The file was extensive: battle commendations, strategic innovations, a leadership profile that marked him as one of the most capable commanders in recorded galactic history. Beside it, like a mockery of truth, hung his fabricated civilian identity. Marcus Chen, maintenance worker, no family, no history, no significance beyond his ability to clean efficiently. "How is this possible?" she asked, though the question was rhetorical. Security clearance protocols, psychological evaluations, genetic screening. How does someone maintain a false identity for over 2 decades in the heart of a military installation? "The same way any deep cover operation succeeds," came a voice from the office doorway. "Through careful preparation, consistent behavior, and the target's assumption that they know what they're looking for." Admiral Kethmore turned to see Director Chen of Federation Intelligence entering without invitation, her Valorian features displaying the calculated composure that marked her species' top spies. Behind her walked a figure that made the Admiral's breath catch. General Marcus Chen in full dress uniform, looking exactly as he had in the historical recordings from the sector wars. "Director Chen," the Admiral said carefully. "I wasn't expecting—" "No one expects intelligence until we arrive," the Director interrupted, "and given the circumstances, arrival has become necessary." She gestured toward Marcus, though this was clearly not the same man who had been mopping floors hours earlier. "Admiral, meet Strategic Consultant Marcus Chen, operating under Federation Council Authorization 77 Alpha." The Admiral's Centaurian neural architecture processed the implications at superhuman speed. Authorization 77 Alpha was legendary within intelligence circles, a designation reserved for operations so sensitive that their existence was known only to the Federation Council's inner circle. Such operations typically involved threats to galactic stability that required solutions outside normal diplomatic or military channels. The Janitor, Admiral Kethmore said slowly, was a Federation asset. "The Janitor was the asset," General Chen corrected, his voice carrying authority that had never been diminished by years of humble service. "For 23 years, the Federation has maintained observation capabilities within this academy through my presence. Your training methods, your institutional biases, your cadets' psychological development, all of it has been documented and analyzed." "Spied upon," Kelneth protested, though his indignation faltered under the General's steady gaze. "Observed," Director Chen corrected. "The Federation Council has been concerned about the trajectory of interspecies relations for some time. Recent Academy graduates have shown increasingly problematic attitudes toward species diversity, particularly regarding humans. Your institution has been inadvertently producing officers whose prejudices could destabilize the entire Federation." The Admiral sank into her chair, the weight of revelation combining with growing political implications. "The dining hall incident was unplanned," General Chen admitted. "Zara's intervention was her own decision, made without knowledge of the broader operation, though I suspect she's known more about my real identity than she's ever admitted." "She's your daughter," Director Chen added, producing a data tablet displaying genetic analysis results. "Not adopted, not fostered, biological. The hybrid characteristics were artificially enhanced to provide cover for her placement in the Academy." Another pillar of assumed truth crumbled. The Admiral stared at the genetic readouts, seeing the careful manipulation that had disguised a fully human child as a Valorian hybrid. The complexity of such biological camouflage implied resources and planning that spanned decades. "This was all designed," Admiral Kethmore breathed. "The Janitor position, Zara's enrollment, tonight's revelation—" "Tonight's revelation was absolutely not designed," General Chen interrupted, showing the first flash of parental emotion since entering the room. "My daughter made her own choices, as children do. She saw cruelty and chose to stop it regardless of the consequences. That courage is entirely her own." Director Chen nodded approvingly, which brings us to our current situation. The operation is blown, but the data collected has been invaluable. We now have comprehensive documentation of how the Federation's premier military academy has been systematically producing officers with dangerous prejudicial attitudes. The question, General Chen continued, is what the academy leadership plans to do with this information. Admiral Kethamore looked between the intelligence director and the legendary general, understanding that her response would determine not just her own future, but the direction of Federation policy toward species integration. The easy answer would be to minimize the incident, transfer the troublesome individuals, and return to established patterns. But looking at the footage still playing on her screens, hundreds of cadets learning to see beyond their trained prejudices, she realized that the easy answer might also be the wrong one. "What do you recommend, General?" she asked finally. Marcus Chen smiled, and for the first time in 23 years, it was the smile of a man who no longer needed to hide his true nature. "I recommend we give the Federation exactly what it needs, officers who understand that strength comes from unity, not supremacy. Starting with the cadets in that dining hall," Director Chen added. "They've had their assumptions shattered. Now we help them build something better from the pieces." The Academy's common areas buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the usual hierarchies of species and rank. In the hours following the dining hall revelation, unofficial gatherings had formed throughout the complex. Small groups of cadets huddled around data tablets, their conversations a mixture of whispered amazement and uncomfortable self-examination. In the Valorian dormitory wing, Crixnell sat alone in his quarters, staring at the scattered remains of his personal achievement display. Every trophy, every commendation, every symbol of his family's superiority lay broken on the floor where he had swept them in a moment of crushing realization. The mining rights his family had fought for, the colonies they had claimed, all of it built on a foundation of lies he had never thought to question. "Crix," the voice belonged to Cadet Zephyr, who stood uncertainly in the doorway. The younger Valorian's scales showed the pale patterns of deep distress, but he held himself with a determination that was new. May I come in?" Crixnell gestured vaguely at the chaos surrounding him. "Why would you want to?" Zephyr entered carefully, picking his way through the debris of demolished certainties. "Because I need to understand something, about what we saw tonight, about what it means." "It means everything we believed was wrong," Crixnell replied bitterly. "Every lesson about species hierarchy, every justification for the way we've treated humans, all of it was built on propaganda, designed to make us feel superior about our ancestors' war crimes." The words hung between them like an accusation. Neither had been alive during the sector wars, but both had inherited the cultural attitudes that justified their species' current dominance. Those attitudes had shaped their worldview, their career aspirations, their casual cruelty toward beings they considered inferior. "I accessed the historical records," Zephyr said quietly. "The real ones, not the sanitized versions they show in class. The Sanctuary Colony bombardment, my grandfather was the fleet admiral who ordered it. He's considered a war hero in our family histories." Crixnell looked up, seeing his own anguish reflected in the younger cadet's eyes. "What did the real records show?" "That Admiral Chen, Marcus Chen, requested a prisoner exchange before the battle. He offered to surrender himself and his entire command staff in exchange for guaranteed safe passage for civilian evacuation ships." Zephyr's voice cracked slightly. "My grandfather refused. He said accepting surrender from humans would imply they were worthy opponents." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of inherited shame. Both had been raised on stories of their ancestors' glorious victories, never questioning what those victories had cost or who had paid the price for their current privileges. "There's more," Zephyr continued. "The evacuation corridors that stayed open during the siege, they were protected by human volunteer pilots flying outdated civilian craft. They knew it was suicide, but they kept the routes clear anyway. My family's official histories don't mention them at all. In the Androrian section of the Academy, similar conversations were taking place with the measured precision characteristic of that species. Cadet Thaisara had assembled a study group of her yearmates, their scaled forms arranged in the geometric patterns that helped their communal minds process complex information. "The tactical analysis is unambiguous," she reported, her reptilian features displaying the neutral expression her species used for delivering difficult truths. "Commander Chen's strategies were not only successful, they were innovative beyond anything in our military databases. The Federation's current tactical doctrines incorporate 17 different innovations that originated from his battlefield decisions. Yet he was prosecuted as a war criminal, added Cadet Morthak, his crest displaying the deep green patterns of confusion. The charges against him were based on his refusal to target civilian populations. In Androrian military culture, such refusal would be considered honorable. In any civilized military culture, Thaisara corrected, the prosecution was political theater designed to satisfy Valorian demands for human blood while avoiding the inconvenience of examining their own conduct during the war. The study group digested this information with the methodical thoroughness their species was known for. Unlike the Valorians, who were grappling with emotional revelations about family honor, the Androrians were reconstructing their understanding of galactic history with clinical precision. The implications for current Federation policy are significant, Morthak observed. If our assessment of human military capabilities has been deliberately distorted, our strategic planning models are fundamentally flawed. More than that, Thaisara replied. If humans are capable of producing officers of Chen's caliber, their current assignment to service roles represents a massive waste of military potential. The Federation may be deliberately weakening itself to maintain an artificial hierarchy. Meanwhile, in the Academy's medical bay, Zara sat on an examination table while a Centaurian medic ran scanners over her small form. The revelation of her true parentage had triggered mandatory genetic verification, a process that was revealing far more than anyone had anticipated. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Sil Enth, her ethereal features glowing with professional interest as data streams flowed across her displays. The artificial hybrid characteristics are extraordinarily sophisticated. Whoever designed this genetic camouflage possessed expertise that exceeds our current medical capabilities. How is that possible? Zara asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Because it wasn't done recently, the doctor replied. These modifications were implemented during your embryonic development, using techniques that were classified even during the sector wars. Only a handful of individuals would have possessed the knowledge and resources necessary for such work. Zara nodded slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The Federation Council's inner circle, more specifically, the Special Projects Division that handled deep cover operations during the war. Your father wasn't just given a new identity, he was given a daughter specifically designed to serve as the perfect cover for long-term infiltration. The words should have been devastating, learning that your entire existence was the product of strategic planning rather than natural conception. But Zara found herself oddly comforted by the revelation. It meant that somewhere in the highest levels of Federation government, people had believed that peace and justice were worth investing decades of effort to achieve. Doctor, she said carefully, what happened to my biological mother, the woman who carried me? Dr. Sil Enth's expression grew gentle with compassion. According to the medical records, she was a Federation intelligence operative who volunteered for the assignment. She died during the Sanctuary Colony evacuation, but not before ensuring you reached the designated safe zone where Marcus could find you. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marcus hadn't simply rescued an orphaned child, he had completed a mission that had cost a fellow operative her life. The weight of that responsibility had shaped every decision he had made for the past 15 years. She knew, Zara whispered. My mother knew she wouldn't survive the mission, but she did it anyway so that someday the galaxy might be a better place for children like me. Dr. Sil Enth nodded. The Federation has always depended on people willing to sacrifice everything for ideals they might never live to see fulfilled. Your parents, both of them, represent the very best of what our civilization can produce. As night settled over the Academy, the conversations continued in dormitories and common areas throughout the complex. Cadets who had never questioned their assumptions about species superiority were discovering uncomfortable truths about their families' histories, their own prejudices, and the foundation upon which their entire society had been built. But along with discomfort came something else, a growing awareness that they had been given an unprecedented opportunity to choose what kind of officers and what kind of people they wanted to become. The future of the Federation was taking shape in those quiet conversations, one changed mind at a time. The Academy's observation deck offered a view of 3 moons hanging like pearls against the star-scattered darkness of space. It was here in this quiet sanctuary above the chaos of the main complex that Marcus and Zara were finally allowed their first private conversation since the dining hall revelation had shattered their carefully maintained cover. Marcus stood at the reinforced transparent steel window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of decades of military discipline. He no longer wore the janitor's coveralls. Those had been replaced with a simple civilian outfit that somehow made him look more like the war hero from the historical records. But the weight in his shoulders remained, the burden of secrets carried too long and responsibilities that extended far beyond parental duty. "You knew," Zara said softly, approaching to stand beside him. At 15, she was small even for her apparent hybrid heritage, but her presence filled the space around her with the same quiet authority her father commanded. "About my real genetics, about the mission, about everything." "Not everything," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but honest. "I knew you were designed specifically to serve as my cover identity's daughter. I knew your biological mother had volunteered for an assignment that would likely cost her life. But I didn't know." He paused, struggling with words that had never been spoken aloud. "I didn't know how much you would mean to me. The mission parameters never accounted for love." Zara moved closer to the window, watching the slow rotation of Kepler Prime's largest moon. "Dr. Silenth told me about the genetic modifications, about how sophisticated they were, how much planning went into making me the perfect hybrid child. But she also said something else." Marcus waited, sensing the importance of whatever revelation was coming. "She said the modifications were designed to be temporary," Zara continued, "that as I matured, my true genetics would assert themselves. I've been gradually becoming more human and less Valorian for years now. By the time I graduate from the academy, there won't be any alien characteristics left to detect." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Federation's plan hadn't just been to give him a daughter for cover. They had been preparing for the eventual revelation of Zara's true nature, ensuring that when the time came, she would stand as a symbol of human potential rather than hybrid compromise. "They engineered everything," he breathed. "Your enrollment in the academy, your academic excellence, even the timing of tonight's revelation. You were always meant to be the proof that humans deserve better than service positions." Zara nodded, but her expression held more pride than resentment. "The question is, do you mind that I was designed to be your daughter instead of born to be her?" Marcus turned to face her fully, his weathered features soft with paternal love. "Zara, the day I found you in that shelter on Sanctuary Colony, you were just an assignment objective, a strategic asset to be recovered and protected. But the moment you grabbed my finger with your tiny hand and stopped crying, you became my daughter in every way that matters. Even though you knew it was artificial, that my attachment to you was programmed, your attachment wasn't programmed," Marcus said firmly. "Love can't be engineered, only encouraged. The Federation gave us compatible genetics and a plausible cover story, but everything else, every shared meal, every bedtime story, every proud moment watching you excel at the academy, all of that was real." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of the Federation, and the quiet sacrifices that held civilization together. Finally, Zara spoke again, her voice carrying a maturity that went beyond her apparent years. "What happens now? With the mission blown, with everyone knowing who we really are?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I suspect the Federation has been preparing for this moment longer than either of us realized. The intelligence value of maintaining my cover was always going to diminish over time, but the symbolic value of revealing the truth at the right moment," he trailed off, pieces of a larger strategy becoming clear. "You think tonight was planned after all?" "Not planned exactly, but prepared for. The Federation Council has been dealing with increasing species tensions for years. Academy graduates showing problematic attitudes toward humans, colonial administrators treating entire worlds as disposable resources, military commanders who see genocide as an acceptable strategic option." Marcus's voice carried the weight of someone who had watched history's patterns repeat themselves. "They needed a catalyst for change. And that catalyst was us," Zara said. "The war hero who chose service over glory, and the human child who could pass for any species, but chose to claim her true heritage. The question," Marcus continued, "is whether we're ready for what comes next. Once this story spreads beyond the Academy, once the Galactic Council starts investigating the circumstances of my death and resurrection, the political consequences will be enormous." Zara moved to stand directly in front of her father, her small hands finding his larger ones. "Are you ready? After 23 years of hiding, of letting people treat you as less than sentient, Are you prepared to be Marcus Chen the hero instead of Marcus Chen the janitor? Marcus looked down at his daughter, designed to be his cover, raised to be his legacy, but loved with the fierce devotion that made both roles irrelevant. I've been ready for years, he admitted, but I was waiting. For what? For you to be old enough to understand the cost, for the Federation to be desperate enough to accept the solution, and for the right moment when the galaxy might actually listen to what we've learned. Zara squeezed his hands, her grip surprisingly strong for such small fingers. Then let's make sure they hear us clearly. Through the transparasteel window, the Academy's lights sparkled below them like a constellation brought down to Earth. In those dormitories and common areas, hundreds of cadets were having conversations that would shape their approach to leadership for decades to come. Some would cling to the old prejudices, but others would carry forward a new understanding of what strength really meant. Dad? Zara's use of the informal title was deliberate, a quiet declaration that their relationship transcended mission parameters or genetic engineering. Yes, I'm proud of you, not just for the battles you won or the lives you saved, but for the man you chose to be when no one was watching, for the father you became when you could have remained just a soldier. Marcus felt something tight in his chest finally release, a tension he had carried for so long that he had forgotten it was there. And I'm proud of you for choosing courage over safety tonight, for standing up when it mattered, even though you knew it would change everything. We make a good team, Zara observed with a slight smile. The best, Marcus agreed. Now let's go show the galaxy what humans can really do when they're given the chance. Together, father and daughter turned away from the window and walked toward the door that would take them back into a world that was already changing because of their choices. Behind them, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small acts of courage that shaped the destiny of civilizations. The main assembly hall of Kepler Prime Military Academy had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. Every cadet, from first-year students to those days away from graduation, sat in rigid formation, while the Academy's senior staff occupied the elevated platform that normally showcased guest speakers and award ceremonies. But today's assembly was neither celebration nor routine briefing. It was a reckoning. Admiral Kethmore stood at the podium, her centaurian features displaying the controlled composure that had carried her through decades of military service. Behind her, arranged in chairs that spoke of hastily revised protocol, sat General Marcus Chen in full-dress uniform and Director Val Shen of Federation Intelligence. Zara occupied a seat that placed her between the Academy leadership and the assembled cadets, symbolically bridging the gap between authority and students, between the hidden truth and its revelation. Cadets of the Kepler Prime Military Academy, Admiral Kethmore began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's advanced acoustics. Yesterday's events have forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our institution, our training methods, and the assumptions that have guided Federation policy for over 2 decades. A murmur rippled through the assembled students, hundreds of young beings from dozens of species, all grappling with the collapse of certainties they had never thought to question. In the Valorian section, Crixnal sat with his head bowed, while nearby, Zephyr maintained perfect military posture, despite the obvious distress in his crystalline features. Among the Androrians, Thisara and her study group displayed the neutral expressions their species used when processing information that challenged fundamental beliefs. The individual you have known as Marcus Chen, maintenance staff, is in fact General Marcus Chen, former commander of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet and one of the most decorated officers in Federation history. The Admiral paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. His presence in this academy for the past 23 years has been part of an authorized intelligence operation designed to assess the effectiveness of our training programs and the attitudes they produce in graduating officers. The murmur grew louder, tinged now with indignation from some quarters and amazement from others. The idea that their most prestigious academy had been under covert observation for over 2 decades raised questions about trust, authority, and the nature of the institution they had devoted their lives to joining. Director Valshin rose and approached the podium, her Valorian features displaying the calculated neutrality that marked her species' master spies. The operation was deemed necessary, she continued without preamble, because of disturbing trends in graduate officer behavior. Over the past decade, Academy alumni have shown increasing levels of species prejudice, particularly toward humans and other beings classified as service species. She gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the assembly, showing statistics that made several cadets shift uncomfortably. 47% of recent graduates assigned to colonial administration positions have implemented policies that restrict human civil rights. 32% of military commanders have filed reports questioning the loyalty and competence of human personnel under their command. 18% have recommended the complete exclusion of humans from command positions within the Federation fleet. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment, forcing every cadet present to examine their own attitudes and assumptions. Many had never questioned the casual superiority they felt toward humans, or the ease with which they accepted their placement in service roles. Now those unexamined beliefs were being revealed as potentially destructive prejudices that threatened the Federation's founding principles. General Chen stood and moved to center stage, his presence immediately commanding attention in a way that his janitor's coveralls had never allowed. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions for entire star systems. "I have spent over 2 decades observing this academy's culture," he said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled cadets. "I have watched promising young officers learn to view entire species as inherently inferior. I have seen compassionate individuals gradually adopt casual cruelty as normal behavior. And I have documented the systematic degradation of the very ideals the Federation was founded to protect." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "But I have also witnessed moments of extraordinary moral courage, cadets who questioned unjust orders, who showed kindness to those considered beneath their notice, who chose conscience over conformity even when it carried social costs." Zara stood from her chair, drawing every eye in the assembly. At 15, she looked impossibly young to be at the center of such momentous events, but when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet authority that marked her father. "You have a choice," she said simply. "All of you. The revelation of who my father really is and who I really am doesn't change the past. The cruelty you've shown, the prejudices you've harbored, the casual indifference to suffering, none of that disappears because you've learned uncomfortable truths." She moved to stand beside her father, their resemblance now obvious without the genetic camouflage that had hidden their relationship. "But what you do with this knowledge, how you choose to act going forward, that will define not just your careers, but the future of the Federation itself." Admiral Kethamore resumed control of the podium, her expression grave as she addressed the practical implications of the situation. "Effective immediately, the Academy's training protocols are under comprehensive review. Our curriculum will be expanded to include mandatory courses on species diversity, ethical command decision-making, and the historical consequences of institutional prejudice." The announcement sparked immediate reaction throughout the assembly. Some cadets nodded approvingly, recognizing the necessity of such changes. Others appeared resistant, their expressions suggesting they viewed the modifications as politically motivated rather than educationally necessary. Furthermore, the Admiral continued, raising her voice slightly to regain attention, "General Chen has agreed to serve as a special advisor to the Academy's leadership, helping us identify and correct the systematic biases that have infected our training programs. And Cadet Velthari," Director Valshan added, "will continue her studies here, though under her true identity as Zara Chen, daughter of General Marcus Chen. Her academic record stands on its own merit, achieved without artificial enhancement or preferential treatment." The weight of transformation settled over the assembly like a physical presence. Every cadet understood that they were witnessing a historic moment, the end of one era and the beginning of another. The comfortable certainties that had guided their worldview were being replaced with more complex truths that demanded genuine moral courage rather than unthinking compliance. "This academy has produced some of the finest officers in galactic history," General Chen said in closing. "But it has also produced individuals whose prejudices have caused immeasurable harm to the beings they were sworn to protect. The question now is which tradition you choose to continue." He looked out over the sea of young faces, seeing in them the potential for both greatness and catastrophe. "The galaxy is watching. History will judge not just your actions, but the character that shapes those actions. Choose wisely." As the assembly dispersed, conversations erupted throughout the hall, some heated, some thoughtful, all animated by the recognition that their world had fundamentally changed. The easy hierarchies of species superiority had been replaced by more challenging questions about merit, justice, and the true meaning of strength. And in the midst of it all, a father and daughter stood together, no longer hiding their relationship or their heritage, ready to help guide the next generation of leaders toward a more just and equitable future among the stars. The news traveled at faster-than-light speed through the galactic communication networks, carried by quantum entanglement relays that connected every major world in the Federation. Within hours of the Academy assembly, the story of the janitor hero and his daughter had reached audiences across hundreds of star systems, sparking reactions that ranged from outrage to inspiration. On Valorian Prime, the crystalline towers of the High Council chambers resonated with heated debate. Elder Quindrol, whose family had controlled mining interests in 17 systems since the Sector Wars, paced before the assembled nobility with agitation that caused his ceremonial rank crystals to chime discordantly. "This is a calculated insult to our entire civilization," he declared, his forearms gesturing dramatically toward the holographic displays showing footage from the Academy. "To suggest that our victory in the Sector Wars was somehow tainted, that our treatment of humans represents institutional cruelty rather than natural order. It's revisionist propaganda designed to undermine legitimate authority." But not all of the High Council shared his indignation. Younger Valorian nobles, many of them parents of Academy cadets, found themselves questioning assumptions they had inherited rather than examined. Councillor Velthara, whose daughter served as a third-year cadet at Kepler Prime, stood to address her elder colleague. "With respect, Elder Quindrol, perhaps the question we should be asking is not whether this revelation insults our civilization, but whether our civilization has become something that deserves insult." Her words carried the dangerous edge of political heresy, but she continued undaunted. "My daughter transmitted recordings of her classes analyzing historical battle data. The tactical innovations credited to General Chen have become standard doctrine in our own fleet academies. How can we simultaneously celebrate his strategic genius and maintain that his species is inherently inferior?" The debate that followed would continue for days, but the cracks in Valorian certainty had already begun to spread. Similar conversations were occurring in council chambers across the galaxy, as established powers grappled with the implications of their most fundamental assumptions being challenged by inconvenient truths. Meanwhile, in the working districts of a dozen human colonies, the story sparked a different kind of response. In maintenance bays and service centers, in agricultural collectives and manufacturing complexes, humans who had spent their lives accepting their designated role as the Federation's servant class were experiencing something unprecedented: hope. Marcus Yates, a human technician maintaining atmospheric processors on New Terra Nova, paused in his work to stare at the news feeds streaming across his tablet. The face of General Marcus Chen, standing proud in full-dress uniform, looked back at him like a mirror reflecting possibilities he had never dared to imagine. 23 years, he whispered to his work partner, a Rigelian engineer who had been watching the coverage with equal fascination. He spent 23 years pretending to be exactly what they told him he was, while secretly documenting how they treated him, and when the time came, he stood up and showed them the truth. The Rigelian's tentacled features shifted in patterns that indicated deep consideration. "What strikes me most is the daughter's courage. She could have remained safely hidden, benefiting from her apparent hybrid status. Instead, she chose to claim her human heritage and defend her father's dignity." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the Federation's human communities, but they carried a new undertone that government monitors were already flagging as potentially significant. For the first time in decades, humans were discussing their situation not as an unchangeable natural order, but as a political condition that might be subject to revision. Back at Kepler Prime Academy, the immediate aftermath of revelation was playing out in countless personal dramas. Crixnall had requested transfer to a different academy, claiming he could no longer function effectively in an environment where his fundamental worldview had been shattered. His request had been denied, not out of cruelty, but because Admiral Kethmore recognized that his discomfort represented exactly the kind of growth opportunity the Academy needed to embrace. "Personal transformation is rarely comfortable," she had told him during their private meeting. "But comfort has never been the goal of military education. Your challenge now is to discover who you choose to be when your inherited assumptions no longer provide easy answers." Other cadets were responding differently. Zephyr had sought out Marcus personally, requesting permission to research his family's historical records and prepare a formal accounting of their actions during the sector wars. The young Valorian's request had surprised everyone, including himself, but he felt compelled to understand the true cost of his inherited privileges. "My grandfather's decisions affected millions of lives," he had told Marcus during their conversation. "I can't change history, but I can make sure future generations understand it accurately." Among the Androrian cadets, the response had been characteristically systematic. Thaisara's study group had expanded into a full research collective, analyzing decades of Federation policy decisions through the lens of their new understanding. Their preliminary findings suggested that human exclusion from command positions had cost the Federation numerous strategic opportunities and diplomatic solutions. "The pattern is consistent across multiple sectors," Thaisara reported during one of their evening sessions. "Situations where human cultural insights or tactical approaches might have prevented conflicts, but human officers weren't present in decision-making positions to offer alternatives." But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the initial revelation, a message arrived at the Academy bearing the diplomatic seals of the Centaurian Empire, the Federation's oldest and most influential member species. Admiral Kethmore read the message with growing amazement, then immediately summoned Marcus and Zara to her office. The holographic display showed the ethereal features of Empress Silandra herself, the Centaurian ruler whose word carried more weight than entire planetary governments. "General Chen," the Empress's recorded message began, "your sacrifice and service represent the highest ideals of Federation unity. Your daughter's courage in revealing the truth honors both your legacy and our collective future. The Centaurian Empire formally requests your presence at the upcoming Galactic Unity Summit, where we believe your insights could prove invaluable in addressing the systemic issues your operation has revealed." The invitation was unprecedented. No human had ever been invited to address the Galactic Unity Summit, the Federation's most exclusive diplomatic gathering. More than that, it represented official recognition from the Federation's most respected member species that humans deserved a voice in shaping galactic policy. "They're not just inviting you to speak," Admiral Kethmore observed, studying the message's formal language. "They're effectively endorsing a fundamental restructuring of the Federation's species hierarchy." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered, and the responsibility that comes with it. This isn't just about correcting historical injustices. It's about proving that humans can contribute meaningfully to galactic leadership. Zara, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke. "No pressure at all," she said, with a slight smile that reminded everyone present that she was still in many ways just a 15-year-old girl dealing with circumstances far beyond her years. But when she continued, her voice carried the same quiet authority that had stopped a dining hall full of cadets 3 days earlier. "The question isn't whether you can prove humans deserve better treatment, Dad. The question is whether the Federation is ready to become what it always claimed to be." Outside the Academy's walls, across the vastness of space, the ripples of change continued to spread. Some would strengthen into waves of transformation, others would break against the rocks of entrenched prejudice. But for the first time in decades, the possibility of genuine change had emerged from the shadows where it had been carefully nurtured by a janitor and his daughter, waiting for the right moment to reshape the galaxy's understanding of strength, service, and the true meaning of heroism. The Federation diplomatic compound on Nexus Station orbited the galactic core like a jeweled crown, its crystalline spires catching and refracting the light of 1,000 stars. For 3 centuries, it had served as neutral ground where the galaxy's most powerful civilizations gathered to shape policy that affected billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. Never before had a human been invited to address its most exclusive gathering, the Galactic Unity Summit. Marcus stood at the observation deck of their assigned quarters, watching the slow dance of diplomatic vessels arriving from across known space. Each ship represented a different civilization, a different perspective on the nature of power and the proper order of galactic society. Within hours, he would stand before their assembled leaders and argue for a fundamental restructuring of assumptions that had guided Federation policy for decades. "You're nervous," Zara observed, entering the room with the quiet grace that had become her trademark. At 15, she moved with the confidence of someone who had already faced the worst consequences of speaking truth to power and emerged stronger for the experience. "Terrified," Marcus corrected honestly. Military command is one thing. In battle, the objectives are clear and the metrics for success are obvious. But diplomacy at this level, I'm about to argue that the galaxy's most powerful civilizations have been fundamentally wrong about the nature of strength and service. Zara moved to stand beside him at the observation window, her reflection overlapping his in the reinforced transparisteel. You've been making that argument for 23 years, she reminded him. The difference is that now they'll be listening instead of dismissing you as irrelevant. Through the window they could see the distinctive bioluminescent hull of a Centaurian dreadnought, its organic curves contrasting sharply with the geometric precision of Valorian battlecruisers and the flowing elegance of Androrian diplomatic vessels. Each ship carried not just ambassadors and advisors, but the accumulated wisdom and prejudices of entire civilizations. Director Chen provided intelligence briefings on the major players, Marcus said, gesturing toward the data tablets scattered across the room's conference table. 3 Valorian High Counselors who consider my existence a personal insult to their ancestors' legacy, 2 Androrian hive minds who view the entire situation as a fascinating case study in political manipulation, and Empress Silandra herself, who apparently believes that this crisis represents an opportunity to strengthen Federation unity through radical reform. What about the humans? Zara asked quietly. Marcus paused, understanding the weight behind her question. There are no other humans at the summit. I'll be speaking not just for myself, but for an entire species that has never had a voice in galactic governance. The pressure is, he trailed off, unable to find words adequate to express the magnitude of responsibility he felt. Crushing, Zara finished, but also exactly what you've been preparing for your entire life. Every battle you fought, every sacrifice you made, every year you spent invisible and unrecognized, all of it led to this moment. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication. The holographic display activated to show Director Valchen's familiar Valorian features, though her expression carried more concern than her usual professional neutrality. General, I'm afraid I have concerning intelligence regarding tomorrow's session, she began without preamble. 3 member civilizations have filed formal objections to your participation, claiming that allowing a service species representative to address the summit would violate established protocols. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, but his voice remained steady. Which civilizations? The hegemony of Shaltor, the Rigelian Trade Confederation, and, unfortunately, the Valorian High Council. They're arguing that Federation membership requires demonstrated capacity for interstellar governance, which humans have never possessed. Zara stepped closer to the display, her young face showing an anger that her father had learned to respect. And the response from supportive delegations. Empress Silandra has threatened to withdraw Centaurian participation if the objections are sustained, Director Valchen replied. The Androrian Collective has submitted detailed analyses demonstrating that human tactical innovations have been integral to Federation military doctrine for decades. Several smaller civilizations are rallying to the cause, but the big 3 carry enough weight to potentially block my participation, Marcus finished. What are our options? The intelligence director's expression grew calculating. Officially, there are established procedures for resolving diplomatic disputes of this nature. Testimony, evidence presentation, formal debates that could stretch on for months while the objecting parties raise increasingly technical procedural challenges. Unofficially? Unofficially, Empress Silandra has suggested that you might consider making your case directly to the assembled delegates during tomorrow's opening ceremony, before the objections can be formally processed. Marcus understood immediately. Rather than fighting the political battle on procedural grounds, he was being offered the chance to make his argument on moral and practical grounds. If he could convince enough delegates that human participation would benefit the Federation, the objections might become irrelevant. It's risky, Director Valchen continued. Speaking without formal authorization could be construed as a diplomatic breach, but it could also be the most effective way to cut through the political maneuvering and address the real issues. What do you think, Dad? Zara asked, though her tone suggested she had already formed her own opinion. Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing in her eyes the same courage that had driven her to stand up in the academy dining hall when she could have remained safely invisible. The same determination to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. I think, he said slowly, that we didn't come this far to be stopped by bureaucratic procedure. The galaxy needs to hear what we've learned, and they need to hear it while the momentum for change still exists. Director Chen nodded approvingly. I'll coordinate with Empress Silandra's staff to ensure you have access to the main assembly hall. But General, I must emphasize, this approach commits you to success. If your address fails to sway enough delegates, the backlash could set human rights back decades. And if it succeeds, Zara asked, if it succeeds, it could fundamentally transform the nature of galactic civilization. The Federation has always claimed to value merit over inherited privilege, but it has never truly tested that commitment. Your father's address could force that test in the most public forum imaginable. After the communication ended, Marcus and Zara stood together in the growing darkness, watching the lights of arriving diplomatic vessels paint constellation patterns across Nexus Station's hull. Tomorrow would bring the greatest challenge of their lives, not just to Marcus's carefully honed diplomatic skills, but to their shared belief that courage and compassion could triumph over prejudice and fear. Are you ready? Zara asked softly. Marcus smiled, feeling for the first time in decades that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. No, but I'm ready anyway. Good, Zara replied, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. Because ready or not, tomorrow we change the galaxy. Outside their window, the last diplomatic vessel settled into its docking bay, its arrival marking the completion of the most significant gathering in Federation history. Within hours, Marcus Chen would either vindicate decades of sacrifice and struggle, or watch the last hope for meaningful change disappear beneath the weight of entrenched prejudice. But tonight, in the quiet darkness between the stars, a father and daughter stood together, unafraid of the destiny they had chosen to embrace. The Grand Assembly Hall of Nexus Station stretched across nearly 2 kilometers of carefully engineered space, its domed ceiling displaying a real-time holographic map of the galaxy, with every Federation member world glowing like scattered diamonds against the cosmic dark. Delegates from 300 civilizations occupied tiered seating, arranged in concentric circles around the central speaking platform, their diverse forms creating a living tapestry of galactic civilization. Marcus stood at the edge of the main entrance, watching as the final delegates took their positions. In the Valorian section, he could see the crystalline forms of high counselors, whose families had shaped galactic policy for centuries. The Androrian collective occupied their traditional geometric arrangement, their scaled forms perfectly synchronized in the group mind state they used for complex decision-making. Above them all, in the elevated Centaurian gallery, Empress Silandra herself presided with the ethereal grace that had made her the most respected leader in known space. "Final security scan complete, General," announced Captain Torvin, the Rigelian officer responsible for summit security. His tentacled features displayed the professional calm that marked his species, but Marcus caught the subtle signs of nervousness that even experienced diplomats showed before history-making moments. Zara appeared at Marcus's side, her appearance transformed by formal diplomatic attire that somehow made her look both older and younger simultaneously. The ceremonial robes bore the colors of no particular world or species, a deliberate choice that emphasized her role as a bridge between old assumptions and new possibilities. "The objecting delegations?" Marcus asked quietly. "Still filing procedural challenges," Zara replied, consulting the diplomatic pad that had become her constant companion over the past week. "But Empress Silandra has invoked her authority as summit host to allow your address before formal business begins. Once you start speaking, protocol prevents interruption until you yield the floor." Marcus nodded, understanding both the opportunity and the risk. He would have perhaps 30 minutes to make his case before the assembled leaders of galactic civilization, long enough to present his argument comprehensively, but brief enough that every word would need to carry maximum impact. "Remember," Zara continued, her voice carrying the wisdom that had grown from necessity over the past months, "you're not just representing humanity. You're representing everyone who has been told their contributions don't matter, everyone who has been relegated to service roles despite their capabilities. The galaxy is full of species and individuals who have been waiting for someone to speak for them." Through the main doors, they could see the ceremonial lighting beginning, bioluminescent displays from dozens of worlds, creating patterns that had marked the opening of Federation summits for over 2 centuries. But this summit would be different. For the first time, a voice would be heard that had been excluded from every previous gathering. "Delegates are requesting final confirmation of your speaking authorization," Captain Torvin reported. his translator rendering the complexity of Rigelian bureaucratic concern into understandable terms. "Tell them," Marcus said firmly, "that I speak with the authority of 23 years of observation, 15 years of fatherhood, and 3 decades of service to Federation ideals that have never been fully realized." The security officer's tentacles shifted in patterns that suggested amusement despite the gravity of the situation. "I'll translate that into more diplomatically acceptable language, General." As the final preparations completed around them, Marcus felt the familiar calm that had always preceded his most important battles. But this was different from military engagement. There would be no weapons fired, no tactical maneuvers, no victory achieved through superior force. Success would depend entirely on his ability to convince beings who had never questioned their assumptions that those assumptions were wrong. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of all genders and species configurations," came the amplified voice of the summit's master of ceremonies, a Centaurian whose role was largely ceremonial, but whose presence added gravity to the proceedings. "We gather today to address matters of unprecedented importance to Federation unity and the future of interspecies cooperation." Marcus stepped through the main entrance, his presence immediately drawing attention from delegates who had never seen a human in the Grand Assembly Hall. Whispered conversations erupted throughout the chamber as beings who had read intelligence reports about the Kepler Prime revelations got their first direct view of the legendary commander who had been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades. By special authorization of Empress Silandra, and with the acknowledgement of the Galactic Council, we present General Marcus Chen, former commander of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet and current special advisor to the Federation Intelligence Service. The introduction was careful, politically neutral, and completely inadequate to capture the magnitude of what was about to unfold. As Marcus walked toward the central speaking platform, he could feel the weight of history pressing down like physical force. Every step took him further from the safety of anonymity and closer to a moment that would define not just his own legacy, but the future of human participation in galactic civilization. He reached the platform and turned to face the assembled delegates, his gaze sweeping across hundreds of alien faces that regarded him with emotions ranging from curiosity to hostility. In the Valorian section, High Counselor Quindral's crystalline features showed undisguised contempt. Among the Androrians, he saw the calculating neutrality that marked their species' approach to new information. But in the Centaurian gallery, Empress Silandra herself leaned forward with an expression of keen interest. "Honored delegates," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's advanced acoustics, "I stand before you, not as a representative of humanity, but as a witness to both the greatest achievements and the most profound failures of our galactic civilization." The hall fell silent, even the whispered conversations stopping as delegates recognized that they were hearing something unprecedented. For the first time in Federation history, a member of a so-called service species was addressing the galaxy's most powerful leaders as an equal. 23 years ago, I accepted a mission that required me to disappear from history, to become invisible, to observe our society from the perspective of those who serve rather than those who command. Marcus paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "What I learned during those years should concern every being in this chamber who claims to believe in Federation ideals of justice, merit, and mutual respect." He gestured toward the holographic galaxy display above them, its lights representing the countless worlds where Federation policy determined the fate of billions. "We have created a civilization that speaks eloquently of unity while practicing systematic exclusion. We celebrate diversity while enforcing rigid hierarchies based on species rather than capability. We claim to value merit while denying entire populations the opportunity to demonstrate their worth." The response was immediate and predictable. High Counselor Quindral rose from his seat, his crystalline form resonating with indignation. "This is exactly the kind of revisionist—" "The speaker holds the floor," Empress Silandra's voice cut across the chamber with absolute authority, her tone carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic precedent. "He will not be interrupted." Marcus nodded gratefully toward the Centaurian gallery, then continued with growing confidence. "The evidence of these failures surrounds us daily, but we have trained ourselves not to see it. How many potential innovations have we lost because their creators were assigned to service roles? How many diplomatic solutions have escaped us because the species who might have proposed them were excluded from decision-making positions? How many conflicts could have been prevented if our leadership reflected the full diversity of Federation membership? He moved closer to the delegates, his presence commanding attention in a way that transcended species boundaries. But I am not here merely to catalogue our failures. I am here to present evidence that change is not only possible, but essential for our survival as a unified civilization. The moment had come for the revelation that would either validate everything he had sacrificed or destroy any hope of meaningful progress. Marcus straightened, drawing on reserves of courage that had sustained him through decades of battle and years of humiliation. The intelligence operation that brought me to your attention was designed to assess Federation military training programs, but what we discovered goes far beyond educational curriculum. We documented systematic prejudices that are producing officers whose biases threaten the stability of our entire civilization. The silence in the hall had become absolute, hundreds of the galaxy's most powerful beings hanging on every word from someone they had been taught to dismiss as inherently inferior. The question before this summit is not whether humans deserve better treatment, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. The question is whether the Federation deserves to survive as anything more than an elaborate system of organized oppression disguised as enlightened governance. And with those words, Marcus Chen stepped fully into his destiny, as the voice of change in a galaxy that desperately needed to remember its own highest ideals. The silence that followed Marcus's challenge stretched across the Grand Assembly Hall like a held breath, the weight of his words settling into the consciousness of beings who had never been forced to examine their own role in perpetuating injustice. In that moment of perfect quiet, the holographic galaxy above them seemed to pulse with new possibilities, as if the stars themselves were waiting for the answer that would define civilization's next chapter. Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. Let me share what 23 years of invisible service taught me about the true nature of strength. I watched cadets learn to treat entire species as inherently inferior, not through malice, but through unexamined assumption. I saw compassionate individuals gradually adopt casual cruelty because it was easier than questioning the system they were part of. He gestured toward the Valorian section, where High Counselor Quindrel sat rigid with barely contained fury. I do not blame the individuals who participated in this system. They were taught, as we all were, that hierarchy based on species was natural law rather than political choice. But natural laws cannot be changed by legislation. Political choices can be. From the Androrian collective came the subtle harmonic that indicated intense group mind discussion. Their scaled forms shifted in synchronized patterns as hundreds of individual consciousnesses wrestled with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about social organization. During the sector wars, I made decisions that saved billions of lives at the cost of my own career, my identity, and my place in history, Marcus continued. I do not tell you this to seek sympathy, but to demonstrate a principle that our current system obscures. True strength is not the ability to dominate others, but the willingness to sacrifice for their benefit. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the assembled delegates. Every species in this chamber has individuals capable of such sacrifice. Every world you represent has produced heroes whose contributions could benefit our entire civilization. But our current structure ensures that most of those contributions will never be recognized, never be utilized, never be allowed to flourish. Empress Silandra leaned forward in her elevated gallery, her ethereal features displaying keen interest. When she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with crystalline clarity. General Chen, your observations are compelling, but observations without solutions remain merely academic exercises. What specific changes do you propose? This was the moment Marcus had prepared for throughout the long journey from Janitor to Galactic Spokesman. Your Majesty, I propose that the Federation establish a new governing principle, merit-based representation at every level of leadership. Not merit as determined by species of origin, but merit as demonstrated through actual contribution to Federation welfare. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates erupted in dozens of languages, their voices creating a cacophony of protest, amazement, and heated debate. The concept of merit-based representation threatened power structures that had existed for centuries, potentially elevating beings who had been relegated to service positions while demoting those who held authority through inherited privilege. High Counselor Quindrell finally found his opportunity to speak, his crystalline form resonating with indignation. This is precisely the kind of dangerous idealism that led to the sector wars in the first place. Social stability requires acknowledged hierarchy, not the chaos of constant competition for position. Does it? Marcus replied calmly, because the evidence suggests otherwise. The most stable and prosperous sectors of Federation space are those with the most diverse leadership, while the regions with the strictest species hierarchies show consistent patterns of unrest, economic stagnation, and diplomatic failure. He activated a holographic display that materialized above the speaking platform, showing economic and social data from across Federation space. The patterns were clear and undeniable. Diversity in leadership correlated strongly with prosperity, stability, and citizen satisfaction across all measured parameters. Furthermore, Marcus continued, our military academy's own data demonstrates that integrated units with diverse species leadership consistently outperform homogeneous commands in both training exercises and actual combat situations. We have been weakening ourselves in pursuit of artificial purity. From the observer gallery came a small but clear voice that somehow carried across the entire chamber. He's right. Every eye in the assembly turned toward Zara, who had risen from her seat with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. At 15, she looked impossibly young to be addressing the galaxy's most powerful leaders, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had already paid the price for speaking truth to power. I've spent 3 years at Kepler Prime Academy, watching brilliant minds learn to discount entire species based on inherited prejudice rather than demonstrated capability, she continued. I've seen tactical innovations dismissed because they came from the wrong species, diplomatic solutions ignored because their architects lacked the proper genetic heritage, and strategic insights overlooked because acknowledging them would threaten comfortable assumptions about natural superiority. She moved to stand beside her father on the speaking platform, their resemblance now obvious to everyone present. But I've also seen what happens when those prejudices are challenged. Cadets who had never questioned species hierarchy suddenly recognizing the waste and cruelty they had participated in. Future officers beginning to understand that true leadership requires moral courage, not just inherited authority. The chamber fell silent again as delegates absorbed the testimony of someone who represented the future they were debating. Zara's presence reminded them that their decisions would shape the galaxy not just for themselves, but for generations yet to come. Empress Silandra rose from her seat, her movement commanding immediate attention throughout the assembly. The Centaurian Empire has listened to these testimonies with great interest, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic wisdom. We find the evidence compelling, and the proposed solutions worthy of serious consideration. She gestured toward Marcus and Zara, her ethereal features displaying something approaching admiration. More than that, we find the courage demonstrated by both speakers to be exemplary of the highest Federation ideals. Therefore, the Centaurian Empire formally proposes the establishment of a merit assessment commission tasked with developing species-neutral evaluation criteria for all Federation leadership positions. The proposal sent shockwaves through the assembly. The Centaurian Empire's endorsement carried enormous weight, potentially swaying dozens of smaller civilizations who looked to them for guidance on major policy decisions. But the real surprise came from an unexpected source. In the Valorian section, a younger delegate stood and requested recognition. Councillor Velthara's voice carried clearly as she addressed the chamber. The Valorian delegation wishes to second the Centaurian proposal, she announced, her words causing gasps of amazement from beings who had expected unified Valorian opposition. Furthermore, we propose that General Chen and his daughter be appointed as the Commission's founding co-chairs, given their unique insights into the current system's failures and potential solutions. High Counselor Quindrell's crystalline form shifted to the deep red that indicated rage in his species, but he was outnumbered by younger Valorians who had been influenced by their children's reports from the Academy. The generational shift that had been building for years finally found its voice in the galaxy's most public forum. One by one, other delegations rose to support the proposal. The Androrian Collective added their analytical capabilities to the Commission's mandate. Smaller species who had been excluded from leadership positions for centuries saw hope for meaningful change. Even some of the traditionally conservative delegations found themselves swept along by the momentum of historical transformation. As the votes were tallied, Marcus felt something he had not experienced in over 2 decades, the satisfaction of a mission truly completed, not through force of arms or strategic deception, but through the patient work of changing minds and opening possibilities that had been closed by prejudice and fear. The final tally was overwhelming. 847 civilizations in favor, 23 opposed, 11 abstentions. The Merit Assessment Commission would be established, marking the beginning of the most significant transformation in Federation governance since its founding. As delegates began filing out of the chamber, their conversations buzzing with excitement and apprehension about the changes to come, Marcus and Zara stood together on the speaking platform, where they had just changed the course of galactic history. "So what happens now?" Zara asked, though her smile suggested she already understood the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Marcus looked up at the holographic galaxy display, where the lights of Federation worlds seemed to pulse with new energy and possibility. "Now we do the hard work," he replied. "Changing laws is easy compared to changing hearts and minds. But today proved that change is possible when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. Even when they're scared, especially when they're scared," Marcus confirmed. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right despite the fear." Zara slipped her hand into his, the gesture simple but profound. "Then I guess we'd better get started. The galaxy won't transform itself." As they walked together toward the exit, father and daughter side by side, the holographic stars above them seemed to shine a little brighter. Somewhere in those distant systems, in academies and service centers, in government halls and working districts, beings who had been told they were inherently inferior would soon learn that their contributions mattered, that their voices could be heard, that their dreams of equality were not just possible but inevitable. The janitor and the cadet had become the general and the commissioner, but more importantly, they had remained the father and daughter whose love had made them both brave enough to challenge a galaxy and wise enough to offer it something better than the prejudices that had divided it for too long. Behind them, the Grand Assembly Hall stood empty, except for the cleaning staff who would prepare it for tomorrow's sessions. Among them, unnoticed by the departing delegates, human workers moved with quiet efficiency, their presence no longer invisible to those who had learned to see strength in service and dignity in every form of honest contribution to the common good. The galaxy would never be the same, and that, Marcus and Zara knew, was exactly as it should be.